All right, my friends, it is the moment of truth. Let's see what happens when we telnet, if we can telnet successfully, over to router 1, because we've run into a couple of issues. We ran into immediately the password required but not set, because you got to have a VTY line password. So we set that, and then we ran into a little bit of issue with the enable password, enable secret, because we hadn't set either one of those. And even though we could telnet successfully, we were stuck in user exec mode where you really can't do much of anything. So let's see what happens now that we have an enable password and an enable secret set. Let me just go ahead and repeat that command. That's the VTY line password, of course. And now when we put enable in, instead of getting the message, there's no enable password set, we get password prompted. And which one do we put in? The enable secret or the enable password? You can't see it, but we do put in the enable secret. That always takes precedence over the enable password. And now we have successfully telnetted to router 1 and we're in privileged exec mode. So I'm going to go ahead and log out of that connection. You should always terminate your telnet connections, by the way. It's just good form. Don't just close the window. Go ahead and do a log out or an exit, and you'll see connection closed by foreign host, and you go from there. Now, let's go to the board for a quick review here and a new command I want to introduce you to. Let's just recap those password rules we've seen so far. There's no password required for the console port, but it is recommended you configure one because the console port has a little bit of extra security built in, a little bit, because you have to be physically present there in order to use it. Now, for the VTY lines, of course, the whole purpose is we don't want to have to be physically present, so we have to have a password configured and for Telnet or SSH. If we want those users to access enable mode, we've got to set an enable password. We just saw that, just did a lab on it. Or we could use a handy little command called privilege level 15. Now, this privilege level is not displayed, the one I'm about to mention. When we were in user exec, there's no message that says you have telnetted in and you are in privilege level 0, but that's really where you are. You can't really do anything. Now, we set up the enable password. That was no problem, and for your production networks, maybe that's what you want to do. You want your telnetting users to come in, your SSH users to come in and be put at user exec, and then have to know the enable password to get to what we call privilege level 15, which is enable mode, and then we can go on and do pretty much whatever we want. But you can also use the privilege level 15 command on the VTY lines, which means that anyone that telnets in successfully is automatically put in that higher enable mode. So they can do whatever they want. They're at privilege level 15 then instead of 0. And what we do is we sidestep the entire enable password issue. Now maybe that's right for your network, maybe it's not. But for lab work, it is wonderful because, what am I doing here on the screen all the time? These are really telnet connections. And what I'm doing is continually going from one router to the other. I don't want to be prompted for an enable password half the time that I'm going to a router, or even all the time when I'm going to a router. Oh, wait a minute, I have to type the enable password. It doesn't sound like that big a deal, but when you start having to do it 50 times in a lab session, you're going to say, do I have to type this password every single time? And with this command, you do not. I'm going to show it to you on the board, and then we'll see it in action. We're going to put it on router 1. It goes on the VTY lines, just like the login command, just like the password command, and it's going to plop you right into enable mode, we hope. We'll see it live in just a moment. Now, I know that the more inquisitive of you, which means all of you, are already thinking, you're already thinking ahead, well, what about all the other privilege levels? And I did the same thing because, again, we like having a middle ground. It's like the unicast broadcast thing. It's like, yeah, we don't want to have all broadcasts, but, a network of all unicasts, that's going to be a lot of work too. It's going to be a lot of overhead. So we needed a middle ground. We came up with the multicast. So you're looking at this already and thinking, okay, I got privilege level 0 and I got privilege level 15, and that's a lot of middle ground. What about privilege levels 1 through 14? What we can do is create custom privilege levels. I'm just giving you a little sneak peek here of future studies because thankfully this is something we don't have to do in the CCENT or the CCNA. And I say thankfully because I'm not a huge fan of the custom privilege levels, but they do come in handy in enterprise networks. What you can do, you can actually tie it down to where you're assigning people privilege levels as they log in, and you could say, for example, that you have to have at least a privilege level of 6 to use any show commands. Or you could say privilege level 8, they're the only ones who can run configure terminal. You can tie it down to one command like that. I mean, you can really get granular with that. That's the good news. The bad news is you can really get granular with that. You can get super detailed and say, I want this privilege level to be able to do this, etc. It's a lot to keep up with. That's the key, because when you start doing this, people at privilege level 9 can use show commands, below that can't. It just always seems to come back, and you seem to always be adjusting it to me. So again, it can come in handy in larger networks, but for right now and when you can, stick to privilege levels 0 and 15, really. You'll be glad you did once you see how to start working with them in future studies. Now, let's go ahead and go over to router 1. We're not telnetting, I'm just resuming my earlier connection. And let's use that command. And you can see default privilege level for line, and you can set 0 through 15 manually. Stick with 15. So now I've got privilege level 15. I always do a save when I leave. Now I'm going to telnet from router 3 to router 1. And I'm prompted for the password, as I usually would be. And now look at that. I'm at privilege mode already. I wasn't prompted for an enable password, even though one is set. I didn't remove that. But privilege level 15 is that powerful. It is a great lab command. And if you can use it in your production network, okay. But again, lab commands for lab environments, it's absolutely wonderful. Great command. And let's see, I want to talk to you about these VTY lines too on routers and switches. And let's go ahead and just a quick reminder here. Probably noticed this already, but we know that we've got 5 VTY lines on our router. And I know it looks like 4. You know, that's fertile ground for an exam question. But if you count them on your hand, which is okay when nobody's looking, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. You got 5 lines. Now on a switch, let me see if I already have an open connection. Okay, I do. On a switch, it's going to look like this, and you're going to have more lines. But usually in the config, they're broken up like this. I've never seen one where it went straight from 0 to 15. But if you want to put, say, privilege level 15 on all these VTY lines, then you could do that with one command. You don't have to do the VTY 04 separate from the 5 through 15. You just do it like this. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So again, getting each line individually, you don't really want to get into that. You should just do a privilege level for all of them, or just leave it so they're prompted for the enable password. But that way, and let's do a quick look at the config, just proof it out. And you can see that privilege level 15 is under both of those. It's not wrong to do line VTY 04 and then line VTY 515 if that's the way you want to do it, but it does save you a little bit of time. And just do it all at one time. So we've got all that covered. Let's talk about secure shell for a few minutes, because we've kind of bunched that in with Telnet. And Telnet is so commonplace still, and I'm using it here, and it's like, okay, so why do we need secure shell? Where does the secure part come in to begin with? Well, Telnet is fantastic. We've been using it for decades, but there is a problem. All of the data that is sent to the remote host, including passwords, is transmitted in clear text. And that's the kind of thing we'd really like to avoid in today's networks, because any would-be network intruder can intercept those packets. They can easily they'll just look at the packet content and say, okay, the password is 11, and I'll just tell that in later and destroy the router. So then we're in real trouble. Secure shell is basically encrypted Telnet, because the basic operation of SSH, it's just like Telnet's, but the data, including the password, is encrypted. Now, for this very simple and powerful and obvious reason, we really love SSH over Telnet. And of course, the obvious question is, then why are we using Telnet instead of SSH? Well, I do mention here SSH takes a little more work. It's just a little more work, believe me. But it's also a hardware issue, because not all routers support it. So, we're certainly not scared of work, but what you have to work with may just support Telnet. But let me show you this database that we can set up, because you can use this with Telnet as well. And I know the word database sends a chill up some people's spines, including mine. This is a very simple database. There's absolutely nothing to it. And what it avoids is what I've occasionally called the one-size-fits-all password for Telnet. Because just talking real world here for a moment, there are networks that I've been the admin of that's been 5 years, 10 years since I've left, and the Telnet passwords are still the same, which is insane. That should never happen. But the thing is, even if you change a password, sooner or later, word of that password gets around. Somebody mentions, oh yeah, just use, Sasquatch for the password, blah, blah, blah. You go back 5 years later, you put in Sasquatch for the Telnet password. Still works. So what we want to do is avoid that one-size-fits-all password. Also, what we can do in a more sophisticated setup, which begins with a database like the one we're about to create, is we can put some accountability in there, because we can set things up to say, okay, when someone logs in and puts in their username and password, and note that I'm saying username and password, not just password, we could set it up so that when people log in like that, their activity is logged. So if the username Chris, password Bryant combination comes in and runs, delete vlan.dat on all the switches and reloads them, we know who did it. So there's some accountability there with the username password database that you don't have with just the one-size-fits-all password. What we can do there too, and what I was talking about with the accountability, we can set up what we call an AAA server. Authentication, authorization, and accounting. Setting up an AAA server is way out of the scope of the exams, but I do want you to know how to set up a Cisco device to perform authentication via a local user password database, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Actually, we're going to throw in an extra lab here, kind of impromptu, so you can see that on the live equipment. Now, the first step is to configure login local on the VTY lines. So let's hop back. Let's go over to router 1. We're going to look at the VTY line configuration again. Now, notice that, of course, we used login earlier. When you're using the one-size-fits-all password, then you just put in login, and that's it. And we see the CR. We know that's a legal command. This TACAC server for password checking, that's where AAA gets involved. We're not getting into that. You'll see it in your CCNA security studies, which I urge you to go after once you're done here. You definitely need a good security background in today's networks, and the CCNA security certification will help you get that. We also have this little login local option that you might have spotted earlier when we were on the equipment. Local password checking. What that means is we're going to use the local database to authenticate users, or not authenticate users, as the case may be. So let's go to the next screen here. Yep, here we've got login local, and what we've got here too next is this command transport input. And if your router does not support SSH, then SSH won't be there. But transport input telnet, transport input telnet SSH, both legal commands. And also you can do a transport input all. There is an option for that. I believe this one particular router, because you've got input and output and preferred, yeah, that one you'll see the all option right here. And here's Telnet. This is not an SSH capable router, so it doesn't have it. So I wanted you to see that in case you look at it and say, well, where's SSH? If your router can't run that, then you won't see it. But you do have the all option, which frankly is what I see a lot of out there. That people don't just put transport input Telnet, they put transport input all. But I want you to know that command. What we're going to do on the very next video is go ahead and create a database, and we'll test it out. There's one thing I want to mention to you here before we go over, actually a couple things before we break this video up, and then I'm going to throw in an extra lab here. We'll see this in action. Now, we can use the username password database for Telnet, and that's what we're going to do on our particular routers here. The key here is that you're going to be prompted for a username and a password when you try to connect. You have to get the entire combination correct. It's not enough just to get one. I know that sounds like, well, duh, but I just want to make that clear, since we did have the one-size-fits-all password earlier. Anybody could put Cisco in or whatever we set it for, and they get in. But here, when someone uses, say, the one on the board, the username of Tim, they have to use the password of Woods or it would not work. They're going to get rejected. And like I said, before we go on to another subject, we'll see that live. There's also a couple of commands I'd like you to know about as far as SSH goes. You have to specify a domain name with the IP domain name command, and you have to generate what we call a crypto key with the crypto key generate RSA command. Now this is one of those things where Cisco just kind of threw this in the CSENT. They're not really asking you to configure the entire thing. I hate just telling you what a crypto key and you need to generate with this command and not get into the details, but we have to stop somewhere on it. You will learn about that in your CCNA security studies. I would know, though, for your CSENT and your CCNA, the steps for basic SSH config. The login local command, I would know the username password combo that we're going to see in a lab next. I would definitely know the IP domain name and crypto key generate RSA command names. So let's, I will set up that quick database video and we'll do a lab next and we'll move on from there. See you on the next vid.